When I walked through my front door, the paperwork to transfer ownership of my house was sitting on my coffee table, and I had never signed a single page. My sister was curled up on the kitchen floor, crying so hard she couldn't even lift her head. In my living room, two people I had never invited into my home were sitting comfortably on my couch, drinking coffee from my mugs, going through legal documents that belonged to me, as if they were the ones who owned the place. Then the man by the window looked up at me. He didn't seem embarrassed. He didn't seem uncomfortable. He simply smiled, the kind of smile that makes an entire room feel colder. "Good," he said. "You're home just in time." That's when I saw what was sitting on top of the stack of folders. A copy of the deed to my house. I still remember exactly what I felt in that moment. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was the feeling of walking into your own home and realizing that someone has already made a plan to take it away from you. The problem was, they had chosen the wrong person to do that to. My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm a petroleum engineer. At the time this happened, I was 36 years old, living alone in a house in Cyprus, just northwest of Houston. I had bought it on my own and furnished it on my own and protected it on my own for 5 years. I wasn't married. I didn't have children. What I did have was a younger sister I would have done absolutely anything for. Megan had been staying in my guest room for 4 months. Officially, she needed a break from her marriage. Unofficially, she was running out of herself. Her husband, Jason Holloway, wasn't cruel or unfaithful. He was something I've come to think is more corrosive in certain ways. A man who had never once, in his entire adult life, chosen his wife over his parents. Not on the important things. Not even on the small ones. And his parents, Robert and Diane, had cultivated that choice so gradually, over so many years, that Jason didn't recognize the dynamic he was swimming in. I had been on a site assessment in West Texas for 12 days. I came back 2 days early because the job wrapped ahead of schedule. I drove through August heat thinking about nothing more important than a cold shower. The unfamiliar black SUV in my driveway made me pause. I sat in my truck and listened. Even through the closed front door, I could hear my sister crying. Megan doesn't cry easily. She never has. When she cries, it means something has been breaking for a long time, and she simply cannot contain it anymore. I had heard that sound exactly 3 times in my life before that afternoon. I pushed the door open. Megan on the floor. Red eyes. Shaking hands. Her 18-month-old daughter Lily asleep upstairs, completely unaware of the storm below. Robert on my sofa with a pen in hand. Diane with my coffee mug, settled in, unhurried. Legal folders spread across my coffee table. I went to Megan first. I always would. I knelt beside her and she grabbed my wrist with both hands the way Lily grabs her fingers when she's frightened. That grip, that desperate, silent grip, it communicated more than any explanation could have. "What happened?" I asked. She opened her mouth, then looked toward Robert. That glance told me everything I needed to know. I stood slowly and deliberately and turned toward him. "What are those documents on my table?" Diane smiled. The kind of smile that is designed to make you feel dramatic before you've even reacted. "Oh, don't alarm yourself. We're just organizing some family paperwork." Family paperwork. I walked to the coffee table and began lifting folders. Property tax records, my address, a loan application, a power of attorney form, a document authorizing a representative to act on behalf of a property owner. My name on every page. My address on every line. The lines for signatures were blank, but everything else had been filled out in advance. Very carefully, very specifically. I thought about the way the folders were arranged, the pen already in Robert's hand, the reading glasses on his face. This wasn't a drop-in visit. This was a closing. "Megan," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat. "Go upstairs and pack a bag for you and Lily. Enough for 3 days." Robert rose immediately from the sofa. "That isn't necessary." I looked at him. Just looked. He sat back down. Megan hesitated only a second before she moved. I heard her feet on the stairs, the soft creak of the nursery door, and then silence. I turned to face the people sitting in my living room. "I need you to explain what you were attempting here," I said, holding up the power of attorney form. "With this." Robert folded his hands the way a man does when he is performing patience. He launched into a prepared explanation. His restaurant group, Holloway's Kitchen, 4 locations across the Houston metro, had encountered a short-term liquidity challenge. The bank required collateral for a bridge loan. Megan was a long-term resident of my property. In a practical sense, with informal consent, the paperwork could be structured to establish her authority to represent the property's equity in the financing arrangement. I'm going to pause here because I want you to understand something about Robert Holloway before this story goes any further. Because this story only makes full sense if you understand what he actually is. He isn't a monster. I mean that. He's something more complicated, and in certain ways more frightening, than a monster would be. Robert had spent 20 years building Holloway's kitchen. He had attended every employee Christmas party. He had shaken hands with every local food critic. He had built a reputation in a city that respects people who build things from scratch. That identity, the provider, the patriarch, the man who makes things happen, was as essential to him as oxygen. When the restaurant started losing money, he didn't reduce or restructure or admit difficulty. He borrowed. When the borrowing wasn't enough, he borrowed again and hid the debt from his own son. And when the entire structure was shaking and there was nothing left beneath it, he looked around for something solid to anchor to. He found my house. I don't believe he thought of it as theft. That is the important thing to understand. He thought of it as reallocation. He had constructed an entire internal story in which family resources were collective resources, and the people who loved him existed partly to absorb consequences that were too large for him to carry alone. He wasn't a man who knew he was taking something. He was a man who had convinced himself that taking was the same as borrowing from yourself. That is what makes someone like Robert more dangerous than a stranger. A stranger knows they're crossing a line. Robert had quietly moved the line to wherever he was standing. "Megan is a guest in my home," I said, when he finished. "She has no ownership interest here. You were sitting in my living room with documents connecting my house to a loan I know nothing about, pressuring my sister to authorize something she has no right to authorize." "Claire, families help each other," Diane said, her voice dropping into that warm, wounded register she used when she needed people to feel guilty for having boundaries. "You have no idea the stress Jason has been under. Victor Robert has spent his whole life building something for this family." That word family landed like a hook. I thought about 14-day rotations on a platform 40 miles from shore, about a satellite phone with a 20-minute daily call window that I rationed like water, about the birthday I spent in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico eating sheet cake from a cafeteria tray because everyone on the platform rotates together. About every hour of ordinary life I had traded quietly and deliberately for the ability to hand a bank a check and say, "Mine." And now this woman was using family as the reason I should hand it over. "You're leaving now," I said to Robert. "And from this point forward, any contact with Megan happens through an attorney." He stood slowly, picked up his jacket from the back of the sofa, and then he turned back, and his voice dropped to something quiet and deliberate. "You should think carefully, Claire. Family situations like this can become very complicated, especially when children are involved." The room went completely still. Lily's baby monitor sat on the kitchen counter. Megan was directly upstairs with her daughter. I stepped close enough that he had to look slightly up to hold my eye. "If you ever use that child as leverage again," I said very quietly, "the next conversation we have will include law enforcement. Are we clear?" His jaw worked. Then he walked out. Diane followed, smoothing her cardigan, eyes forward, not looking at anyone. When the front door closed, Megan came downstairs with Lily on her hip and a duffel bag on her shoulder. She sat at the kitchen table and put her forehead against her daughter's hair and didn't say anything for a long moment. I locked the deadbolt, checked the front window, and sat across from her. "Tell me everything." And she did. The story came the way stories do when someone has been carrying them alone for too long in pieces, in the wrong order, with long pauses where the weight of a thing becomes too heavy to hold and too important not to say. Robert's restaurants had been in trouble for 2 years, not months. Diane had been hiding invoices. Jason had taken out personal loans to help his parents without telling Megan. She'd found the statements in a kitchen drawer. When she confronted him, he cried, told her half of what was true, and asked her to trust him. Then she came to stay with me. And after that, the questions started. Diane called regularly. Careful, conversational questions. How long had I owned the house? Was there a mortgage remaining? Did I travel for work often? Was Megan's name on any utilities? Megan thought it was nosiness. Then Jason started asking whether Megan handled any paperwork at my address, whether my name was on her mail, whether she thought I'd be willing to help the family through a difficult stretch. And then Robert arrived with folders. He told Megan it was procedural. He said I would understand once it was explained. He said that if the company collapsed, the weight of it would follow her forever. And then Diane said something that Megan repeated in a voice barely above a whisper. She said that Lily would grow up knowing her mother had chosen a sister's pride over her father's future. A tear ran down Megan's face. I reached across the table and covered her hand. Then I stood up, went to my office, closed the door, photographed every document in the stack, and called James Cardwell. James was a property law attorney I'd known for 6 years, methodical and precise, exactly the kind of person you want on the phone when something this specific has gone wrong. I told him everything in flat factual sentences, sent him the documents through encrypted email, sat at my desk and watched the clock on the wall and didn't move. 22 minutes later, my phone rang. "Where exactly did these come from?" he asked. "My living room. About an hour ago." "Did you sign anything?" "No." "Did your sister?" "No." A pause. The deliberate kind, where a person is choosing how to arrange what they know. Some of this is preliminary. But the structure, the power of attorney language, the ownership declaration, the authorization forms, this is designed to establish fraudulent authority over your property. If they've submitted anything resembling this to a lender, we are looking at mortgage fraud, potentially forged instruments, potentially wire fraud depending on what they've communicated electronically. I looked through the office doorway at Megan, sitting at the kitchen table, her hand moving rhythmically over Lily's back. A motion that exists only to have something to do with your hands when the rest of you doesn't know what to do. James continued. "Do not confront them further yet. Preserve everything. Security footage, texts, emails, voicemails. And understand this. If Robert is this deep in, he is desperate. Desperate people don't stop. They find another angle." I looked at the window. "Then we'll be ready for it." I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, a legal pad, and a cup of coffee that went cold before I touched it. The house was quiet. The security system was armed. I organized the front porch footage. Robert and Diane had arrived at 1:47 p.m. The hallway camera had captured enough of the living room to prove they had documents and had been reviewing them before I arrived. By 4 in the morning, I had a complete evidence file and a list from James of exactly what not to do. The hardest instruction was simple. Do not scare them off too soon. Diane's text arrived at 8:14 a.m. Careful, warm, framing the previous afternoon as an emotional moment for everyone, expressing hope that we could speak like adults. I read it twice. Then I typed back that I needed time to think, and that if their intent was genuinely to help Jason, they should send me exactly what they needed, signed, and why. Megan looked up. "You're responding to her?" "I'm building a record," I said. Diane's reply came within 9 minutes. Relief in every sentence, openness, the assurance that nothing about this was illegal. Families do this all the time. I forwarded it to James with a single word. Continue. Robert emailed me that afternoon. Polished language, someone had worked on the sentences. He laid out the situation in terms that were designed to sound like financial planning. Short-term liquidity challenge, bridge financing arrangement, representation of ownership interests. At the bottom, revised documents, cleaner than before. This time my name was spelled correctly on every single page. That detail made my hands go cold. Because it meant the documents they'd brought to my house were not sloppy preliminary drafts. They were practice. I forwarded everything to James and texted back to Robert. Before I consider anything further, I need to understand the full scope. Can you give me a number? He replied in under an hour. $580,000. I sat back in my chair and read that number 3 times. Megan was standing in the doorway of my office. She covered her mouth. "This isn't panic," I said. "What?" "This. The documents, the emails, the amount. This is a plan." I turned the laptop toward her. He didn't come to my house because he was desperate and running out of ideas. He came with pre-filled forms and a number already decided. This was premeditated from the beginning. She sat down slowly. "Jason knows." I didn't answer right away. She looked at the table. "He asked which utilities were in my name at your address." I thought he was just trying to understand where Lily and I were living. Her voice went very quiet. I didn't think. The hardest thing about this moment wasn't what it confirmed. It was watching my sister's face absorb the specific pain of realizing that someone she loved had known and said nothing. 2 days later, Jason called. She let it ring twice. Then she answered and put it on speaker. He spoke fast. His mother had told him I overreacted. His father had a workable plan. It wasn't what it looked like. Megan waited until he finished. Did you know about the documents they brought to Claire's house? Silence. Did you know? They just needed a few more days. Dad said that if you talked to Claire afterward, she'd understand. Afterward. She set the phone on the table. For a moment, the kitchen was very quiet. Then she picked it back up. I'll call you when I'm ready. And she ended it. That evening, James called with the piece of information that changed the entire shape of what we were dealing with. A contact at the lending institution had reviewed the package Robert had already submitted. It contained a signed declaration from Megan, asserting she had authority to act on behalf of the property owner. Megan hadn't signed anything. The witness signature on the affidavit was Jason's. I stood in the hallway for a long moment after James said it. The house was completely quiet. Lily's monitor on the counter was still. I could see Megan in the kitchen, and she didn't know yet, and for just a moment I held that knowledge alone. James continued, precise and careful. If we stopped the loan process immediately, Robert could claim misunderstanding. But if he proceeded, if he appeared at a formal meeting after these emails, after this documented escalation, after we had given him every opportunity to withdraw, he would own every decision he had made. I understood. We were going to let Robert Holloway walk 10 more feet before the floor gave way. When I replied to the meeting invitation he sent for that Friday, a commercial lending office near the Galleria, I wrote, "We'll be there." Somewhere across Houston, Robert Holloway probably read that message and felt something close to relief. He had no idea what would be walking in with us. Friday morning arrived gray and thick, the kind of Houston August humidity that presses against you before you open the door. I was up before 5, past anxious. On the far side of it, where everything becomes simply what it is and what it needs to be. At the table, Megan sat in a clean blouse with Lily on her lap. She looked composed in a way that surprised me. I asked if she was ready. She looked at me. "I need them to see my face when the truth comes out," she said. "I've been invisible in that room for years, not today." That was my sister. We parked at 948. Glass building, manicured shrubs, expensive cars. Places like this are specifically designed to make transactions feel legitimate. The architecture says, whatever happens inside these walls is serious and official and real. That's exactly what predators depend on. Robert, Diane, and Jason were already in the conference room when we arrived. Robert stood immediately when we entered, spreading his arms, performing warmth the way a salesman performs closing. Then he saw James Cardwell. Then he saw the two people who walked in behind James. A senior fraud analyst from the lending institution, and a detective from the Houston Financial Crimes Unit. The conference room became something entirely different. Robert's presentation lasted approximately 4 minutes before it began to visibly deteriorate. He spoke about opportunity, about hardship, about sacrifice, about loyalty. Every polished phrase he had prepared. He slid a folder across the table. I didn't touch it. I opened my briefcase and placed 7 folders on the table instead, one at a time, quietly, deliberately. Security footage, email records, text messages, the original documents from my living room, the revised documents Robert had sent by email, property records, the evidence of the fraudulent declaration that had already been submitted to this institution with my sister's name and her husband's signature as witness. The fraud analyst picked up the first folder. He began reading. The room became very still. Diane reached for Robert's arm. He sat rigid. Jason stared at the table. He had not looked at Megan once since we walked in. Robert tried to interrupt twice. Both times the analyst raised one hand without looking up, and Robert stopped mid-sentence. "I want you to understand what that moment represented." For 20 years, Robert Holloway had been the loudest voice in every room he entered. He had built an empire on the ability to control a table, and a single raised hand from a man reviewing documents was now enough to silence him. Finally, the analyst looked up. "Mr. Holloway, the documentation submitted to this institution contains declarations that do not appear to correspond to any signed authorization from the actual property owner." A pause. "This raises serious concerns." "This is a misunderstanding," Robert said. His voice had lost its shape. "The email record submitted today suggests otherwise," James said quietly. The detective, who had been still the entire time, leaned forward. "Mr. Holloway, we're going to need to schedule a formal conversation. I'd strongly advise you not to submit or alter any further documentation before retaining legal counsel. Diane made a sound I had never heard from her before. Not her performance crying, the soft wounded sighs calibrated to generate guilt in the people she was working. This was real. Fear. Pure and unmediated. The sound a person makes when the thing they have been running from for years finally stops moving and turns around. Jason covered his face with both hands. And Robert looked at me. Not with anger. He was past anger. He looked at me the way a man looks when he has just fully understood, completely and too late, that the person he spent an entire week trying to outmaneuver had spent that same week quietly, methodically, without raising her voice once, building the case that was now ending his life as he knew it. He opened his mouth. I thought he might apologize. Claire, he said, we can still work something out. I looked at him for a moment. The same man who had sat on my sofa. The same man who had watched my sister cry without moving. The same man who had used her child's name as a threat. No, I said. We can't. Megan spoke then. The first word she had directed at him all morning. Her voice was steady. Completely steady. In a way I had not heard from her in years. You could have just asked for help. Robert stared at her. That's all you had to do, she said. Tell the truth and ask. And we would have figured something out together. She shook her head slowly. But you couldn't do that. Because asking for help meant admitting you needed it. And that was the one thing you couldn't survive. Nobody had anything to say to that. Because it was true. And everyone in the room knew it. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Documents were gathered. The detective exchanged information with the analyst. Robert and Diane were told to remain available. As Megan and I walked out through the glass lobby into the August heat, Lily reached up and grabbed a handful of Megan's hair. Megan laughed a real laugh, surprised and unguarded, and pressed her forehead against her daughter's. That sound in the middle of all that glass and consequence felt like something cracking open. Not breaking. Opening. The investigation expanded faster than James expected. Other lenders surfaced within weeks. Former business partners came forward. The structure that emerged was not of a company facing a temporary challenge. It was of a company that had been hollow for 3 years while Robert borrowed and hid and shifted and papered over every crack. The restaurants were gone by December. Bankruptcy proceedings followed. Former employees spoke. The reputation Robert had spent 2 decades building came apart in a matter of months. Jason began showing up for Lily consistently after that. Not dramatically, not asking for credit, just present. I don't know what that cost him internally. But he kept showing up. And sometimes that is where the only kind of redemption available to a person actually begins. Megan filed for legal separation in October. No scene, no revenge. Paperwork, signatures, a night of quiet crying she did on her own. Then she got up in the morning and made coffee and looked for an apartment. This story taught me something I want to leave with you. The most dangerous people in your life are rarely the ones who feel threatening. They're the ones who have constructed an entire internal story in which their taking is actually someone else's giving. Robert Holloway didn't walk into my house believing he was committing fraud. He had told himself a version of events in which family resources were collective resources, and the people who loved him existed partly as collateral. That internal story, sincere, elaborate, and completely detached from reality, is what made him so difficult to reason with directly. You cannot win an argument with someone who has rewritten the terms of what winning means. The mistake most people make when they encounter someone like that is assuming the behavior is personal. It isn't. It is structural. It is what happens when someone has never once been held accountable for the gap between what they claim to give and what they actually take. If this story is sitting with you, here is one specific thing you can do today. Look at the authorizations and documents connected to your property, your finances, and your legal identity. Know what exists. Know who has access to what. Know what your signature can and cannot be attached to. The people who exploit others rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, with organized folders and polite voices, and the word family used as a master key. And ask yourself this question. Is there someone in your life right now who uses your love for them as the reason you should absorb their consequences? Sit with that. You don't have to answer it out loud, but you should answer it honestly. 6 months after that Friday, Megan called me from the parking lot of a 2-bedroom apartment in the Heights neighborhood of Houston. I could hear the smile before she said a single word. I drove over that evening. We sat on her balcony after Lily fell asleep, with the city lit beneath us and the air finally cool enough to actually feel. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't come back early." I looked at her. "I was so tired," she said. "They kept saying Jason would lose everything because of me, that Lily would grow up knowing what I'd cost her father." A pause. "I think I might have signed." The night held that for a moment. "But you didn't," I said. "But I almost did." She turned to look at me. "That's what frightens me most, not what they tried to do. That they almost managed it. Because I was scared enough, and exhausted enough, and guilty enough, that almost was real." He held her hand. "Almost doesn't count," I said. She smiled. "The real one. The one I'd known since she was 7 years old and would climb anything just to see how high it went." I drove home through Houston that night with the windows down. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the truck for a while before going inside. The house looked exactly as it always had. Same front door. Same porch light. Same oak tree in the yard. But it felt like mine again. Completely. Here is what I understand now that I didn't fully understand before that afternoon. A home isn't its square footage, its deed, or what a bank says it's worth. A home is what it protects. Robert Holloway thought he walked into a financial asset. What he actually walked into was a family. And a family, when it stands together, is not as simple to dismantle as a desperate man imagines. He came to take something from me. He left without everything he had spent a lifetime building. And Megan found herself again. Which, if I'm being honest with you, is the part of this story that matters most. Before I go, I want to ask you something. Drop a number in the comments. 1, if you believe Megan made the right decision walking away from Jason. 2, if you think she should have tried harder to rebuild the marriage. And 3, if you have ever been in a situation where someone used your love for them as leverage over you and you'd like to share. I read every single comment. And tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. Because I always want to know who's out there listening to these stories. If you've ever been made to feel that protecting yourself makes you the villain in someone else's story, this one was for you. Protecting yourself is not betrayal. Standing between your family and the people trying to harm them is not aggression. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is nothing loud. Just patience, documentation, and the willingness to let the truth arrive on its own schedule. If stories like this reach something in you, please subscribe. New stories go up every week. And every one of them is about someone who found out sometimes barely in time, sometimes too late, and sometimes exactly when they needed to, what they were actually built to withstand. I would be honored to have you along for the next one. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Houston, Texas to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.